Hey everybody, welcome to another Grayscale Gorilla tutorial. My name is Jake Allen, and I am a senior 3D animator and designer at Swarovski here in Chicago. And today we're going to go over how to create these beautiful form loops in Cinema 4D. Now this is a super cool effect because, as you can see, nothing kind of shows up on the screen unless these strips of geometry are displaced up and down. So not only are we going to go over how to create these using the MoGraph system and clones, we're also going to show you how to use effectors to create this kind of bouncy, springy effect. This one is super fun, so I can't wait to get started. Let's dive in. So the inspiration for this effect is from this really cool company out of Sydney, Australia called Never Sit Still, and they're a motion and branding studio out of Sydney, Australia. And they did this really cool campaign for Hearing Australia, which does world-leading research and hearing services to Australians for over 70 years. This whole project is really interesting. If you visit their website at neversitstill.tv and scroll down, this is basically like a masterclass in creating things using just light and shadow. And it's really beautiful, and they have a lot of these really gorgeous setups in both 3D and 2D. But the part that we're going to focus on is at the video at the very top. In the video, if I click play right here, you can see they have these strips of sort of geometry, these kind of rectangles that react right to left and left to right. And they also look like they're kind of masked out from a circle. And this is really cool because the forms themselves are only defined by their light and their shadow. And you can see in the lighting, it's really soft, it's really inviting, and it just creates this kind of calming look. It looks like there's a light coming from the left and maybe another sort of fill light coming from the right, but that's pretty much it. And the only way that you can tell these forms exist is when they bounce up and down. So let's try to recreate this effect in Cinema 4D. So I wanted to make a quick aside before we get started about how this project came together. And it's really interesting because there's a couple of different ways in Cinema 4D that you could achieve this effect. And the first thing that I thought of was using, polygons and deformers and all these different tools right here to create a sort of displacing effect. The interesting thing about that is that all of these polygons and points being pushed around in Cinema 4D are actually kind of heavy to calculate when you clone them across, 10, 20, 30 of them in the viewport. So I'll open this example file that I have just to give you an idea of where our thought process went. To start out with, I have a cube and I have a displacer with a linear field. This is really cool, and it gives that kind of wavy effect if you move it back and forth. If this linear field is a spherical field, you can see that it kind of has that same effect. And when I move it left and right, you kind of get this movement of it moving up and down. Now, the first thing that's an issue is it kind of tilts back and forth. And the other thing is, as I was stating earlier, all of these points and polygons can get really heavy when you do all of them across your screen. So we kind of kicked this idea around at Grayscale Gorilla, and a really simple solution was figured out, and that was using MoSplines. So I'm going to hide this cube setup that we have right here, and I'm going to unhide the curve. Basically what we're doing is using a MoSpline, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar, a MoSpline comes with the MoGraph toolset, and anything in this list that has MO before it means that it works with the MoGraph toolset. So things like effectors, randomizers, step effectors, target effectors, all those things work with these different tools. So for this, we're calculating all of our deformations on a simple curve. Let me hide this sweep and hide this rectangle real quick. And I'm going to take our MoSpline and go into our width and set it to 1, just so we can see what it looks like. Now, the MoSpline is a really cool object because it lets you adjust things like the length, it lets you adjust the segments, you can adjust the angles, you can curve it, you can bend it, and you can deform it, all while keeping it kind of procedural. So if you don't bake down the MoSpline, it's really convenient because you can make changes down the road. Now, what we're doing right here is deforming just the MoSpline, and then at the end of this stack, we're doing a rectangle, and we're sweeping it along the curve. So all of that calculation, all of that deformation is being done on the curve, and we're going to duplicate these curves in Cinema 4D. And Bezier curves, as they are here in the MoSpline, are a lot more performant under the hood. What that means is that rather than having to calculate all of those points polygons and vertices that this cube had, all it's doing is calculating these points on a curve. And these are just a lot simpler mathematically for the program to calculate. And duplicating them on the viewport is also a lot faster. So you can get really, really performant results, meaning you can animate practically in real time or as fast as your graphics card allows. So it's really cool in that way. And this kind of made me rethink a lot of the ways that I build setups in Cinema 4D, because this MoSpline setup is just so fast and also much more flexible than anything else that we came up with. So let's dive in and start building this setup using MoSplines and plane effectors. So the first thing we're going to do is create a MoSpline. So we're going to go up to the MoGraph menu, and we're going to create a MoSpline by clicking here. Now, as we stated before, the MoSpline is a really interesting object. It basically creates a spline that can be affected by all of the MoGraph tools. It has a couple modes over here. We're going to stay in simple mode, but there's also spline mode where you can import a spline into MoSpline and affect it using those methods, or turtle mode, which is a special thing called an L system, where you give it a set of commands and it grows on its own. Both of those modes are super duper cool, and I highly encourage you to check them out. But today, we're just going to stick with the simple mode. Now, after switching it to simple, we're going to go to the simple tab and look at all the settings in here. I settled on a length, right now it's at the default, which is 200. I settled on a length of about 800. And I didn't change any of the other settings. I mean, steps right here is the amount of divisions between the start and end point. We also have segments, which are kind of duplicates of the curve. And then we have these things that can bend it, turn it, and twist it. So the next thing we want to do is clone our MoSpline and create the splines that we're going to sweep across for our animation. Now, we know that our objects are going to be swept at the end of this effect. So if I go up here to the curve tools and I create a rectangle, this seems kind of big. So a shape size that I settled on was like 50 by 50. That seems more appropriate. So we're going to put this curve, this MoSpline, in a cloner, and we're going to push it to the right by 50 units every single time it does a clone. So let's do that right now. We're going to go up to MoGraph, we're going to create a cloner, and we're going to drop our MoSpline in there. Now, by default, it's set to grid array. So what we're going to do is change it from grid array to linear. And what it's doing is it's creating a clone, and it's pushing it up by 50 units, but in the y-axis. So it's going up instead of to the right. And we can see by this red arrow that that's the x-axis. So all we have to do is change that to 0 and change this guy to 50. The next thing we're going to do is start positioning our camera so we can figure out how many of these clones that we need for our shot. Now, I'm going to be using Arnold as our renderer, but a lot of what I'm showing today is kind of render agnostic. So however you want to create your camera, you can do so by just going to Create and go to Camera and click on Camera. But for me, in Arnold, I can go to Extensions, C4D2A, Arnold Camera, and choose Perspective Camera. This isn't doing anything super special. All it is doing is just creating a Cinema 4D camera and adding an Arnold tag to it, which gives me all the information I need for Arnold, like depth of field, the aperture size, rolling shutter and exposure, and all that cool stuff. Now I know I want this render to be viewed from the top down. So what I'm going to do is middle mouse click, or you can always go up here and click this button. But for me, this is what I do. I'm going to middle mouse click, and I get my 4 views. And I'm going to go into this top view right here and switch it from top to perspective. So this way, I get a second view of my scene. And there's the camera that we're going to be looking through. Now, I want to make sure that this camera in this window is the active camera. So I'm going to click this little square. And then I'm going to go into the camera and go to its coordinates and make sure that it's facing directly down. So I'm going to press 0 for rotation. And if I look right here, I can rotate it negative, probably by 90 degrees. Yep, there we go. And it's facing perfectly up and down. Now what I'm going to do is take the Move tool, which is already selected, and I'm going to grab this one right here that lets me move it on the YX axis and go like this. And what I'm doing is I'm moving it until in my frame on the left, the lines are kind of fitting up and down from the top to the bottom. This might require just a little bit of nudging like this. There we go, there we go. And I'm going to push it over to the left like this. And I don't want the tops of my geometry to show in the render, so I'm going to pull the camera down ever so slightly and move it to the left. Ta-da! There are our splines. So next up, I'm going to go to the cloner, and I'm going to click on this guy. And under the object settings, we have a count, which is the amount of clones that we have. And I'm going to keep going up until it fills the frame. Previously, I found that about 28 was the sweet spot for this. And lo and behold, there we go. I got lucky this time, but it fits perfectly left and right. And we can nudge the camera a little bit so that they're centered if we want. We can always adjust this later, but this is kind of the shape that we want in our render, and this is kind of the angle that we want in our render. So the next thing we're going to do is start deforming these splines. Now, as we've said before, because they are Mo splines, they actually work with the MoGraph system. So you can put any kind of effector on there and have them pushed or pulled or rotated and all the sweet stuff that all these effectors can do. What we're going to do is just use this plane effector right here. And what that does is it takes each of these splines and pushes it in whatever direction we want, or scales them, or rotates them. So what we're going to do is we are going to make sure that this plane effector is affecting the Mo spline. So I didn't have the Mo spline selected. So if I go into effectors, I can drag this plane effector in there. And you can see right now what it's doing. It's just pushing the Mo spline up by 100 centimeters. And that's super cool. But what if we wanted to only affect part of the spline? So right now, it's pushing up every single point on the spline by 100 centimeters. So if we go into the fall off tab, we can actually create a spherical field. And what this will do is it will mask our effect to just the inside of the sphere. Whoa, look at that. We got some kind of cool new wave effects right here. And as you can see, anytime that it's inside this sphere, it gets pushed up by 100 centimeters. And once it's inside this fall off sphere on the inside of our field, it reaches the maximum height, which is 100 centimeters. Now, we don't necessarily want it to plateau like this. So what I'm going to do is go into our spherical fields settings and click on the remapping tab. And you can see right here that it goes from 0 to 100% about this far into the field. So the closer it gets to the center, it goes from 0 to 1 right there. Or I'm sorry, 0 to 100. But basically the field is telling it 0 to 100%. What we want to do is take that inner offset and slide it all the way down so that only the lines that are at the very, very center point of the sphere get this kind of curve. But you can still see that it looks a little linear. It's a little not very smooth. So one of the ways that we can change that is by going into the contour settings. So we're going to click on contour and we're going to go to curve. And what that does is it lets us multiply our curve by a spline that we have right here. And what I'm going to do is I found that I got a cool look by just taking this very last spline. And if I hold control, it will snap horizontally, so I won't be like this. Whoa. Let me just undo that real quick. If I hold control and slide, we'll get like a nice sort of smooth bump, kind of this bell curve effect right here. So we've got the deformation happening on these Mo splines. And to keep our scene just a little bit more organized, I'm going to take this plane effector and I'm going to move it underneath this cloner, just so that I know I have my camera on top, I have my cloner, and I have my plane effector right here. And I'm going to rename these just so it's a little more organized. We're going to call this one line cloner. And we're going to call this one line cloner plane effector. This is just always kind of a best practice that I do where the effectors are named after the cloners that they affect. So it's just easier that way. And something else I can do is take this and paste it in front of here. So it starts to get a little long, but we've got our line cloner plane effector, spherical field. We've got our line cloner plane effector, and we've got our line cloner. This just makes it easier if you filter your object manager. You can find things, and whatever you click on, you'll know exactly what it's for. So whenever we click on this and we find it in our object manager, if it's a much more complicated scene, it's easier to look at it and say, oh, okay, I know exactly what this is. This is the line cloners, plane effectors, spherical field. You can always name this anything else. I mean, I know that this is getting kind of long, but just for best practice, I like doing this. Now we've got the deformation happening with our sphere, but we're not getting any of that kind of springy motion that we saw in the animation. The only thing we're getting is this immediate feedback. So the moment it goes inside the sphere, it just gets pushed up. And that's cool, right? Like, it's an interesting effect, but it's not necessarily what we want. We want it to have that kind of bouncy feel. So one of the ways that we can do this is we have this plane effector. What we're going to add is another effector on the mouse spline. So I'm going to open up this cloner and click on this mouse spline, and I'm going to add one more effector, and that is the delay effector. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the delay effector basically just adds a delay, just a time delay between 100% of the effect of the effector, so pushing it up by 100 centimeters, and it basically smooths it out a little bit. It adds some time between them and kind of blends them together. Now, the delay effector is actually time dependent. It's technically simulating, quote unquote, under the hood as you move the effector around. So when the playhead is not playing and you're moving the field around, nothing's going to happen. Because what it's doing is it's actually looking at the delay effector and it's trying to add time to it and smooth it out. So whenever you add a delay effector or anything like that, you have to make sure that the playhead is playing and then you can see the effects. Now, 72 frames is actually kind of short for this kind of thing. So to make it more fun to experiment, I'm just going to add a lot of frames to this. So I'm going to type in something like 2000. And I'm going to click here and make sure that my timeline shows all 2000. And when I click play, you'll see this delay effector start to affect where the lines are getting pushed, and also it will add a little bit of a delay to the effect. So rather than being instantaneously pushed up, you'll see that there's kind of a smoothness added to it. It's not necessarily that apparent because the strength of the delay effector is kind of low. But if I go into the delay effector and I go into parameter, if I go into effector and I raise the strength up to something, say, like 90%, you'll see that there's more of a delay between the start and the end. It's almost as if it's like kind of like a lazy effector. It's, it's smoothing it out. So even if I go really fast through it, it doesn't change it that much, but it gives it that kind of slow effect. Now, one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is save your file right now. So I'm just going to do save project as, and I'm going to call this form loops v001. This is just so that we've saved where we are. But basically, you can either turn on autosave or just save your scene file and make sure that you're constantly saving, because we don't want to lose any of the work that we're doing. What we're going to do next is take a look at this delay effector one more time. And there's this thing called mode. A lot of these objects in Cinema 4D have these modes. For the delay effector, there's blend mode, there's even mode, which is a little bit like blend that we're not going to use right now. But there's also spring mode. And spring mode is a lot like blend, where it smooths it out, but instead of blending it and slowly moving between 0 and 100%, it actually looks at the movement of the object and adds kind of like a spring deformer to it. And you'll see what I mean when I click play on the timeline. So if I click play and I click on our field, now when I move through, you'll notice that it has this kind of jiggly effect. And what it's doing under the hood is it's looking at the value of the plane effector, 100 centimeters, and when it hits 100 centimeters, it uses a delay to kind of add a negative value, positive value, negative value, positive value, until it sort of springs into effect. And basically, if I move it like so, it goes, 100, then it goes negative 90, then it goes 80, then it goes, 60, then it goes 20, then it goes 0 again. And if you change that strength value, that's how you get more or less springiness. So you can see with a lower strength value, it's kind of like a super taut guitar string right here. So it's not really bouncing that much. You get a little bit of that kind of cartoony bounce, but not a ton. For our effect, we want it to be really smooth and really friendly looking. So I'm going to click on the delay, and I'm going to leave it at what I had before, which is 90%. Now when I click on this spherical field and I move it around, as you can see, we get this kind of nice this kind of plucking guitar effect right here. And if we move it through at a constant speed, we get this kind of wave. So very cool. While playing around with the scene, the spring might seem a little strong. Even if I move this really fast, it can look kind of harsh. It can look a little cartoony. So what we'll end up doing is adding another delay, but instead leaving it on blend. So it goes plane effector, spring, and then delay, which will smooth it out. So let's do that right now. We're going to go up to our MoGraph menu, and we're going to make sure that our Mo spline is highlighted just because I want to automatically add it. And to keep the two delay effectors from getting confusing, we're going to rename this one right here from delay to spring. That way we know exactly what it's doing. So this is our line cloner plane effector, this is our spring, and just to make our naming convention sort of the same, I'm going to name this line cloner spring. Whoops, I forgot a space. Line cloner spring, line cloner spring. There we go. And I'm going to add one more, and we're going to call this the line cloner smooth. So if I click on the delay, I'm going to set this to something like, the value I believe we ended on was like 43%, and we'll leave it at blend. And what it's going to do is it's going to slow it down. And I'm going to call this line cloner smooth. So very cool. So how do we know what order of operations these effectors go in? Because I can move this up here and the spring will still be affecting it before the smooth. And that's in the settings of the Mo spline. So under the effectors menu, you can see right here that we have the line cloner plane effector going first, then we have the spring going second, and then it smooths it out going third. So let me click play again on the playhead and move this spherical field around. Whoa. And we get this kind of springy effect, but there's an ever so slight smoothness to it. And as you can see, because we're only affecting curves, we're not actually affecting polygons or edges or vertices. It runs really fast. It basically is running in real time, and I can just really easily move it around and kind of experiment and play with it. I mean, I feel like I could do this all night. Whoa. Whoa. So it's super fun. So one of the things that we saw in the final effect was that the displacement of these rectangular strips was limited by two masks at the very beginning, two sort of invisible circles, keeping the effect limited to those areas. Now, to do that, it's actually a lot simpler than you think. What we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this spherical field, and these names are actually getting a little long, so I'm just going to delete plane effector right here, and we're going to call this line cloner spherical field 01, and we're going to call this line cloner spherical field 01 mask. What we're going to do is we're going to take this spherical field mask and we're going to pull it in, and I'm going to press the middle mouse button so I can see my four views, and we're going to limit it to one of these areas. I'm going to say around here. Now, the other field is about the same size, so it might result in a little bit of weirdness. So what I'm going to do is just expand it so that the size is about the size of the composition. I'm going to pull this back all the way, and now we're going to use this as a mask for this field. To do so, all I have to do is go into our plane effector, and you'll see that this second spherical field that we created isn't actually linked to the plane effector. The only thing that's actually affecting it right now is this spherical field 01. So to make a mask out of this, in previous versions of Cinema 4D, I believe in R20 and below that have the field system, you would bring your mask in and you would set your blending mode to clip. But there's a new feature in R21 and beyond where you can actually create a mask in this list by clicking this one right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this spherical field mask into this mask list. And now, without changing any settings, this entire field is masked by this mask right here. So now if I click play and I move our big spherical field, you'll notice that the effect is limited to wherever that sphere is. It's a little tiny right now, so I'm going to take that mask and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Very cool. But what that means is as I move this by in sort of a linear fashion, you can see that it's only in that circle. Now, the reason I was naming these so specifically is because I want to make a second setup for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this spherical field, and I'm going to control click on this spherical field, and while holding control, I'm going to drag it down and duplicate them both. Now I accidentally moved them outside of the hierarchy of the plane effector, so I'm just going to drag them up like so, and now they're all in the plane effector list. They don't necessarily have to live here, but for organization purposes, it's kind of nice just to have the fields affecting their effector as children of it. So I'm going to rename this as O2. I'm going to rename this as O2 mask. And I'm going to move this mask from this left side over to the right side. So now we have two masks. We've got one on the left and one on the right. But I need to link these to the plane effector. So to do that, I'm going to go back into our plane effector. I'm going to minimize this hierarchy right now in the fall off list. And I'm going to bring in our second spherical field. Very cool. And I'm going to click on that second spherical field, and I'm going to click the mask button. And I'm going to drag, whoops, I clicked outside of it. I'm going to click that plane effector one more time. And I'm going to click and drag that mask into there. So we have our two masks in there, right? But if we want to make sure that they work together, we can leave their blending mode at normal. But if they were going to overlap slightly, like let's say I click and hold both of these, and I'm sorry, if I just click the mask and I move it over here, we might want to change it to something like screen so that their maximum values overlap. Just like a Photoshop blending mode, if I set this to screen, it will make sure that this value right here is still visible and it gets merged with this value. But because they're not overlapping, I'm actually going to undo moving that. And I'm going to leave it at normal for now. The next thing we want to do is create one more field that goes from left to right. So we've got one masked, another one masked, and then we've got one more that goes do-do-do-do-do-do and goes across the whole thing, and then we have our loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our spherical field O2, and I'm going to control drag it underneath here so that it gets duplicated. Now Cinema 4D likes to name it O2.1, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename it to O3. There we go. Now this one doesn't get masked. This one just moves across the entire plane of lines and just animates across them. So I'm going to make this one a little bit smaller, about yay big, so that it's about the same height as the masks. And then I'm going to move it back over here. Now once again, I want all of these to affect each other. So if I go into the list of fall-offs and I drag the spherical field in, I can see that this is going to overwrite everything below it. So rather than leaving it at normal like we did just a second ago, I'm going to change it from normal to screen. And we don't have to, but I'm just going to change this from normal to screen. So now all of these are getting blended together. This one doesn't have a mask because you can see that there's no hierarchy to it. Spherical field O3 just has the regular line. But now all of them should work together so that wherever 3, 2, and 1 are moving, we'll get that effect of the curves being deformed. So we've got everything set up. Let's animate our fields so that the deformation effect happens over time. Let's take spherical field O1. And in the animation that we created, I ended up moving that spherical field from the left to the right over about 2 seconds. So let's go back to our very first frame, and let's make this timeline a lot smaller. Let's say something like 400 frames. And now let's go to spherical field O1, click on the coordinates, and we'll notice that it moves side to side in the x-axis. So we're going to create a keyframe by clicking on this button right here. We're going to go 1, 2 seconds, and we're going to go to frame 48. And what I'm going to do is move it over here, and just for value's sake, I'm going to move it all the way past the lines and click X. Now, Cinema 4D likes to add easing automatically, which is really cool, but it's not what I want. I want this thing moving at a constant rate. So what I'm going to do is right-click on this position X value and go Show F-Curve. And as you can see on the screen right here, we've got our F-curve for the position X value. If I highlight both of these and I click on this button right here that says linear, it will automatically set these keyframes to linear. And that way, our sphere is moving at a constant rate. And as you can see, the sphere that's being masked has the effect go do-do-do-do-do, but it's only limited to that area. Let's do the exact same thing, but the opposite, going right to left, using the second spherical field. So on this spherical field, we're going to click on the red axis, and we're going to move it all the way over here, and we're going to set a keyframe. But instead of being at frame 0, I'm going to click and drag this keyframe so that it starts at frame 48. So it goes 1, 1000, 2, 1000 to 48, then 1, 1000, 2, 1000 to 96. So let's go to frame 96, drag this all the way over here, and make sure that we click this button to add a second keyframe. Once again, it'll automatically add easing to it. So I'm going to right click and go to its F curve, highlight it, and make it linear. There we go. So now we got 1 and 2. And because all of this dynamic animation is set up and it's all procedural, we can just click play and it does all the hard work for us. It calculates the amount of push and pull. It adds the spring effect. So what about the last one? Well, the last one, we're going to go from frame 96 to, I'm trying to think, let's say 144 maybe? Or maybe we'll go even further to 168, I believe is where I ended up in this animation. So 168. So let's start at 96 and grab spherical field 03, add a keyframe on the x-axis, go to 168, right there, and click and drag, whoops, my bad, click and drag all the way over here. Same thing, I'm going to want it to be linear, so I'm going to go show F-curve. I'm going to make sure I highlight all of my keyframes and set it to linear. I'm sure there's a shortcut to do this that's a little bit faster, but this is just the way that I've gotten used to it right now. So now everything is all linear. If we go 1 and 2 and then 3. Now the animation of the fields doesn't look very elegant, right? It just goes doot, doot, and it kind of rigidly moves back and forth. But in our final render, we're not going to see any of that. We're just going to see these lines, and we're going to see the sweeps that are made out of them, and it's going to have that kind of elegant motion. So let's go ahead and sweep the mow splines so that we can see our rectangles and the animation that they have in real time. To do that, we're going to go back to our starting frame. I'm going to minimize this linear clone plane effector, and I'm going to go to this button right here with the extrude, and I'm going to create a sweep. And what we want is we want the rectangle to go in first. So that is the profile that we're going to sweep along the curve. And then we're going to put in our line cloner with all our mow splines in it. Uh-oh, that's weird. So it's only sweeping along one line. Now this is kind of tricky. This is something that you might have to debug in Cinema 4D for other things as well. But what's happening is the line cloner is creating multiple objects under the hood. And the sweep only takes 2 inputs. It takes the profile and it takes the next object, which represents the profile or represents the curve that the profile is going to be swept across. So if there's multiple objects under the hood, the sweep object is just going to throw the rest of these away. So all it says is, oh, I see that very first curve. I'm going to throw the rest of these away and I'm just going to sweep that. Well, how do we combine all of these together so that Cinema sees all of them as just one merged together unified curve? To do that, we're going to use the connect object. To create a connect object, we're going to go up to this button right here that has the cloner, and we're going to click connect. Now, the connect object normally is used to take 2 polygonal objects and kind of weld them together. You might see that in a lot of other Cinema 4D content online, and it's what I use it a lot of the time for too. Let's say you have 2 halves of an object that you want to merge back together that are symmetrical. You can put them in a connect object, and boop, there you go. Now you've got an entirely full object. But something that I learned recently is you have this weld option. If you uncheck weld, all it's going to do is take all of these objects and just merge them in Cinema 4D's eyes. So when we take this line cloner and we put it under the connect, all Cinema 4D sees is this singular object made up of multiple splines. So rather than being object 1, 2, 3, all the way to 28, it's got one object with 28 splines inside of it. And when you have an object that's singular with multiple splines in it, the sweep object will sweep across every single curve piece that's inside of it. So because we've kind of fooled the sweep into thinking that the second object is unified, we'll get that sweep effect across all of these splines. So let's take that connect object and let's make it the second object in the sweep. Ta-da! And now we have all of our sweeps. Now, we're in wireframe mode right now, and so it's kind of hard to see what we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is go to the display and change it to quick shading. And as you can see, all of them are lined up, so we don't see any sort of effect. But if I click play, whoa, look at that. There's our effect right there. And, ooh, that's a calming wave. Wow. I could watch this all day. But actually, let's finish up this tutorial. So we want to make sure that it loops at the very end, and we're going to give it a little bit of time afterwards to kind of settle down. So after this wave, we're going to say around like 240 is when the loop happens. So now if I switch it to 240 and we move this guy across all of our rectangular objects and we wait, you'll see that it loops around perfectly. I believe I can add a few more frames to that. Let's do something like 248 and click play. And now we've got a little bit of breathing room and these rectangles will stop. And there we go. And to the viewer in the render, it doesn't look like these are snapping back to their original positions. We'll just have that same animation going the whole time. So let's take a look at what this looks like from the top view or our main camera. This isn't necessarily the top view, it's just a perspective camera aimed directly down at our animation. So I'm going to make this full screen and I'm going to click play and I'm going to see how it looks. Ooh, that's kind of interesting. Okay, look at that. Oh, wow, very cool, very cool. All right. So a couple things I'm noticing. The one thing is the perspective is a little strong, and I think that has to do with the focal length of the camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this focal length from 36 to something like 75. And because I changed the focal length, it kind of zooms in a little bit. So I'm going to go back into this perspective view, and I'm going to pull this backwards until our rectangles fill the frame one more time. There we go. And I want to make sure that they're cut off ever so slightly at the left and right, because I don't want people to see that there's no more rectangles in either direction. I want it to look like it's just a flat plane going infinitely in every direction. So now I'm going to go back to our starting frame. I'm going to click play. Oh, and it's not animating because this isn't the active viewport. So I'm going to make sure I click over here and you can see the white outline. And now when I click play, there we go. There's our animation 1. There's our animation 2. And our last one right there. That's very cool. All right, let's take one more look at it. Animation 1, animation 2. Whoa. Very cool. Now I'm noticing that there's a little bit of the edge that you're able to see, so I'm going to pull this camera down ever so slightly. And that's where we're at. One thing I also noticed is that I don't think there's enough breathing room at the end for these rectangles to kind of settle, because we don't necessarily want people to see a shadow and then have it cut back to a completely flat plane. So I'm going to do something like, I believe in the final animation, we settled on 264. So now there's just enough time that this stuff can settle, and when it loops, it's going to be perfectly flat again. So there we go, and this one right here. Very nice, and we'll just let them settle. Now it's a little hard to see in the viewport, so one of the things I like to do is go into options and turn on screen space ambient occlusion. And what that does is it basically just adds a very fast ambient occlusion pass to the viewport, so you can kind of see the intersections of the rectangles a little bit better. It's kind of hard to see while it's in motion, so if I pause it and I turn it on and off, you can see what I mean. So there's nothing right here, but when I add SSAO back on, you can see that it has a little bit of a shadow, a little bit of ambient occlusion there that just makes it easier to view in the viewport. Very cool. Look at that. Now it also looks like our camera is not perfectly centered. We know that our lines are 800 units tall. So in the Z dimension, it's at 396. I'm going to change this to 400, which is 800 divided by 2. And now it's in the center. I'm going to do the same for our spherical fields and spherical field masks. So I'm going to take this, set it to 400. I'm going to take these and set them to 400. And that just means that everything's going to be centered once we animate it. There we go. And there we go. So next up, we're going to take this scene and we're going to start lighting it. And that's one of the tricky parts about this, because you want it to look really soft and very friendly. And we're going to go over how to achieve that look using Arnold. But these techniques are basically render agnostic, and you can try this in Physical, you can try this in Redshift, Octane, anything like that. But let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so to start lighting our scene, I'm going to go into my extensions menu, go to C4D2A, and pull open my interactive preview renderer. Now, it kind of gets in the way right here, so I'm going to click play. Oops, I'm going to set my scale back to 100%. And I'm going to grab this little hamburger button right here, and I'm going to put it right there. When I click play, I can resize it so it's just about the right size. If I zoom out, I can see that about 25% will fill this window without completely overtaking the IPR. So I'm going to set the zoom back to 100%, and I'm going to set the scale to 25. There we go. So now we can see our scene, but obviously there's no lights in here. So one of the things we can do just to see our scene really quickly is add an Arnold skylight. And it kind of creates the effect that we're going for. It isn't necessarily the same thing. I'm going to raise this back up to 100% so we can see what it looks like around here. It's kind of what we're going for, but when I look at the final product of the video that we're trying to create the effect from, it looks like there's actually lighting coming from the right and shadows coming from the left and shadows on the right. So rather than using this kind of universal soft light, I'm going to delete the Arnold sky, and we're going to do something with two area lights to create the same kind of effect. To make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to grab this guy and slide it over, and this guy and slide it up. And I actually didn't need to do that. I'm just going to slide it over, and I'm going to slide my object manager up and my attribute manager down. There we go. Now we can see a little bit better of a view. To start with, I'm going to create a Arnold area light. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Extensions, Arnold Light, Quad Light. In Arnold, we have these quad lights right here. And the scene is going to go dark because it's currently set to garage shading. But what I'm going to do is switch it to quick shading so that I don't really see any lighting in here. I'm just going to see my lighting in here. I'm going to go to our four panel view and go into our perspective view and look where the light is. So it's facing this direction. This isn't necessarily what we want. I'm going to face it 90 degrees down. There we go. We're going to rename this light to light left, because I'm going to have it cast light from this side of the scene. So let's click play again on the IPR, and we can see that there's no light being shown right now because this guy is super tiny. And I'm going to move it up, and you can already see in the IPR that it's affecting the view. Now, if I go into the light left and I uncheck normalize, what this does is it makes it so that the larger the light, the brighter the source of light, the smaller the light, the softer the source of light, or the less strong, the weaker the source of light it is. And normalize lets you set kind of a brightness of your light. Let's say I want it to be, 2.99. Let's just move that up to 3. I can change the size of my light like so, and if normalize is on, it means that no matter the size, it automatically adjusts it under the hood so it's the same amount of brightness. Now, it's totally preference up to you whether you leave that on or off, but sometimes I like to leave it off because it lets me adjust my lights and get kind of a more realistic response where the larger lights are a little brighter and I can adjust them, and that way I'm not fiddling too much with the exposure settings when I have normalize on, trying to make sure that it's brighter as it gets bigger and weaker as it gets softer. Sorry, did I say weaker as it gets softer? I meant weaker as it gets smaller. Now I'm going to take this light, and with my IPR off, I'm just going to move it so that it moves a little bit faster. After a little bit of trial and error, I noticed that if I move the light up here to the left and I make it a lot bigger, I want the light to be about yay big. Now, you can follow along with these values, but sometimes I like to just do it by sort of feel. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this back on. And you can already see that with the light a little bit farther away and a little bit bigger, we get these kind of soft shadows on the right-hand side. And this is kind of the start of what we want. It's not universally flat like it was with the skylight, so it gives it a nicer look. It also gives it a little bit of variation in brightness. We can see in the upper right-hand corner and lower right-hand corner that it's a little darker. We get variation over here. It just adds a little bit more realism to it and a little bit more life. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it. Whoops, my bad. I'm going to rotate it like, oh, I did it again. There we go. I'm going to rotate it only on this axis, just a smidge, and that way the shadow's a little bit longer. But as you can see, with a smaller light source, we'll get sharper shadows, and that's not necessarily what we want. So if I go back, we have a brighter light source, and we have this kind of soft shadow. Now, this would work, but it's a little dark over here, and in our final render, we want it to be not so varied in terms of brightness. The other thing that we noticed is that there is kind of a white highlight on one of the sides so that the left side looks like it's being lit and the right side looks like it has a shadow. To achieve this was a little bit tricky. I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to have a light casting light over here. I'm going to have another light casting light over here, but it ended up casting two shadows, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to take light left, and I'm going to control drag it so that I duplicate it. Whoa, that's bright. We're going to change those settings in just a second. I'm going to name this light right. And I'm going to make this light so that it's completely, oh, I'm having trouble with the rotation, so that it's completely facing down. And I'm going to click the move tool and drag this guy over to the right. Okay, so as I move it farther away, the lighting gets softer. And this is kind of the effect that we want. Basically, the light from this light on the right is kind of cutting through these shadows a little bit. They're not so harsh. They look a little bit lighter and softer. But as you can see, this light right here is also casting super long shadows. So in renderers these days, we can actually tell the light not to cast shadows. You can do that in Arnold. You can do that in Redshift. I believe you can do that in Physical and Octane. And we're going to do that here. I'm going to scroll down until I see this checkbox that says Cast Shadows. And when I uncheck that, you'll see that rather than darkening these areas on the left-hand side, they stay a little bright. And if I zoom in, you'll see that there's kind of like a white highlight on the left-hand side, and then these soft shadows on the right-hand side. And that's kind of the look that we're going for. Now, the IPR preview is going to be a little pixelated because it's trying to keep it rendered in real time. But if I click play, you can see that that effect is happening as the timeline plays. So we've got our first one, do-do-do-do-do. We got our second one, do-do-do-do-do. And then we have our last one. And as Arnold converges on the image, you can see that we have that same effect. And the lighting is looking pretty nice. So the next thing to do is to adjust the material right here, because to me, it's looking a smidge shiny. And the best way we can do that is by creating an Arnold material. So with our IPR turned off, this play button up here turned off, I'm going to go to Create, Arnold, Surface, and I'm going to create a standard surface. In your render engine, you can create whatever the standard material is as well. But for Arnold, I'm going to open this one up. Now, this is something that I don't play around with that much, but I noticed that when I turn off the specular highlights, so we just get diffuse, and we raise the diffuse roughness up to 1, we get this really sort of flat, kind of velvety, uniform look. And this ended up being a material that reacted really well with our lighting setup. So let's take our standard material, apply it to the sweep, and now click play on our IPR. As you can see, we have this really nice effect going on. Now, the brightness of the material is a little bit lower, so what we can do is we can tweak it by going into our base color and adjusting it accordingly. I'm going to raise it up so that it's closer to 100% white. And there we go. So now we've got this less reflective, kind of very soft material on here. We've got these soft shadows, and we've got these kind of white highlights on the left-hand side of these rectangular strips. The only thing left is to kind of address a few of the issues that you may see in the renderer. For example, there's a little bit of noise here in the light, and we can do that by adjusting the sample settings in our renderer and in our lights. So let's turn off the IPR once again and click on one of these lights. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there is a sample setting. And what that means is that's how many times that Arnold is going to be sampling that light by shooting a ray and hitting that light. And the less rays that hit that light, the more noisy these shadows are. It's actually really nice to have this option here in the lights, because if a very particular shadow is bothering you, you don't necessarily have to go into your global settings and change everything here. You can just up the sample settings in each of these lights. So we know that light left is casting a shadow, so we're going to raise that up to 4. And then we're going to click play on our IPR. And to make things run a little bit faster, I'm going to hold Shift and drag a box so that we can limit it to this area and see how the shadow looks. And you can already see that that noise that we had in the shadow is basically gone. For the rest of our render settings, we're going to duplicate this across both of the lights. So I'm going to click on light right. I'm going to change the samples to 4. I'm going to click settings, and I'm going to change this for our final render. It's at 3. I'm going to change this to 5. And because a lot of this is diffuse lighting, there's very little or basically no specular reflections, there's no transmission, subsurface scattering, or volume indirect lighting. I think Arnold automatically will ignore these, but we can just leave them at 2 for now. What we want is we want to raise this up by 1 more sample. So when we finally render it, we'll get really, really smooth results. If I remove our box by clicking this button and click play, and we let Arnold converge on this render, we'll be able to see that once it's finished, just give it a second for the final render. These are the production quality results. So to make it so we can just check a region, I'm going to turn that box on again rather than waiting for the whole image to go. We can see that when it's done, we've got a very, very smooth shadow, very, very smooth lighting, and not much else that we have to worry about. All that noise was in those shadows, and that's pretty much gone. So I think that we're at a setting where we can get ready to render this and take a look at it while it's animated. So let's finish up our render settings. I'm going to go up here and click on this render settings button, and I'm going to make sure that this is set to Arnold Renderer. And as we did before, we changed all of our sampling settings here. I'm going to go to the Save menu, and for me, I like to save it to EXR, and you can do 32-bit or 16-bit, it doesn't totally matter. For me, I'm going to set it to 32-bit, and I'm going to leave the alpha channel off because there's nothing transparent here. And I'm not doing anything with multipass compositing. There's no mats, there's no crypto mat, there's no Z-depth pass or anything like that. So I'm just going to uncheck this box right here. Now the path that I want to save it to, I've already got in my clipboard, so I'm going to paste it in. So I've got Jake, Documents, Grayscale Gorilla, Form Loops, Render. I'm going to add a slash, and I'm going to name the scene file. I'm going to call it Form. Whoops, I added an enter on accident. I'm just going to undo what I did and repaste this in. And try one more time. Form underscore loops. And I'm going to call this V001. This is also just a good best practice. I like to have the render have the name of the scene file. So if I ever stumble across a render again, I can always know that this render came from form loops V001. And that just makes it easier for me. Once that's all set, let's go to our output settings. And we know that it goes from 0 to 264 frames. So I'm going to set it to preview range. And we've got it set to 1280 by 720. I want it to be a little higher quality than that. So I'm going to change it to 1920 by 1080. And that's pretty much it. It's good to go. So let's render this guy, and then we'll come back when it's already finished. To start the render, I'm just going to go up here and click Render to Picture Viewer. Okay, so pause on that render for just a second. I have a quick little addendum. I made some tweaks to the scene just for aesthetic purposes, and I wanted to make sure that you were aware of those. So I took these masks right here and this third field, and I made them about 242 centimeters. And then I took these two fields and I made them about 337. The lights were a little bit strong, so I ended up taking them down to an exposure of 2 and giving them an intensity of about 1.43. The last thing I wanted to talk about is you may want to cache your animation before you send it to the cloud or before you send it to a farm, or even if you're rendering it at home. Part of the reason because it reduces the amount of computation that you have to do at render time. And if you're sending it to a farm or the cloud, usually those services will render frames at random. They'll assign them to different nodes online. Because this is time dependent, the spring and the smooth, you'll want to make sure that it's cached before you send it to the cloud so that the farm nodes can jump around and render whichever frame they please. Now you'd think that it would be cacheable with the MoGraph cache tag, but the MoSpline object actually doesn't work with the MoGraph cache tag. What we can do, though, is bake the sweep to Alembic. This is a feature that's been in Cinema 4D, I believe, since R20, and it's really useful. If you're not familiar with Alembic, it is a point cache format. It basically stores all the geometry data, the points, the polygons, the edges, all that stuff. And if your point count doesn't change, it will only store the animation data. So it's actually kind of an efficient format. If your point count does change, it can store the whole geometry every single frame. So it does work that way. But it's really useful in Cinema 4D because there's a feature where you can right-click on an object, bake it to Alembic, and then you can turn off everything else in your scene so that at render time, the only computation being done is pulling in the Alembic file and rendering it. So let's try that right now real quick before we actually officially render this scene. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on this sweep, and I'm going to click this Bake as Alembic option right here. This little window will pop up. And what Cinema 4D will do is it will bake this object to Alembic, and it will save it in the same folder as our scene. So if you throw it on a farm or something like that, you want to make sure that you reference this path right here, and that will be the Alembic file that you upload with your scene. Most render farms these days, though, are probably smart enough to see that and will grab that file for you, but you never know. But what we can do now is once we have this Alembic file, I can actually deactivate all of these objects, and I can hide all of them. And what we'll see is our sweep object, but just the geometry cache. And now I can actually scrub through my scene very quickly, and there's no computation time, and it's really easy for the computer to jump between different frames if it's looking to render something. It's also helpful if you have something at home that you want to render, and you say, oh, I forgot to render frame 128, for example. You can jump to it without having to start from the beginning of the timeline and go all the way to that frame. So I'm going to save this, and this will be my official render, and we'll take a look at it in just a second. Okay, and here's the finished render in the picture viewer in Cinema 4D. It's a pretty hefty EXR sequence, so it doesn't look like it loaded completely in RAM. But if I zoom in, you can see that we've got these nice soft shadows. We've gotten rid of our noise using our light samples. And in general, it's just a nice sort of soft, friendly render. I rendered out to EXR partially because I was planning on bringing it into a compositing application like After Effects or Fusion or Nuke. And with all that extra data in there, you can push and pull the color a little bit more easily. If you don't plan on doing that, I would recommend you render to an 8-bit format like PNG or JPEG, and then you can actually just right-click on your image sequence, go Save Image As, and you can set it up so that you can render an MP4. It's pretty straightforward, but if you render out from EXR, there could be some weird color shifts or gamma shifts, so make sure you're just rendering to an 8-bit format if you plan on exporting straight out of the picture viewer. So I ended up taking my animation and running it through After Effects and just exporting an MP4, which is the video that we saw earlier. And this is our beautiful form loop. Whoa, look at that go. And because we set it up at the very end, it ends up looping. Well, there we are. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and picked up some interesting topics about the procedural nature of most splines and how much more performant curves can be under the hood than actual geometry deformation. And it's definitely made me rethink some of the workflows that I do when I'm building setups in Cinema 4D. As always, you can hit up Grayscale Gorilla on social media. Feel free to leave us your questions and comments, and thanks so much for stopping by. This is Jake Allen for Grayscale Gorilla.